Now it's time where we cross over to our OCR for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, geopolitics in East Asia are as complicated as ever. A high-stakes summit took place last week between the leaders of the United States and China, followed by a meeting of South Korean, US and Japanese ministerial officials. None of them produced major deliverables or outcomes and only seemed to confirm their differences amid the growing regional tensions and rivalry. And today we discuss the latest developments with Mason Richey, Associate Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, and Joseph Bosco, former China Country Director for the Secretary of Defence and opinion contributor to The Hill. Now, let's start with a recap of last week's meeting, Mason, between the South Korean Vice Foreign Minister Choi Jong-gon, US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, and Japanese Vice Foreign Minister Takeo Mori, who met to discuss regional developments, challenges, and were set to hold a joint press conference afterwards. However, Japan refused to join the conference in protest of South Korea's police chief visiting Seoul's Dokdo Islets, which Tokyo, of course, claims as its own. And while disputes over Dokdo are nothing new in Seoul-Tokyo relations, of course, but Japan's decision to drop out of the joint presser altogether was considered quite an unusual move, as a previous Korean police chief visit to Dokdo in 2009 wasn't exactly a diplomatic issue. So why do you think Tokyo reacted so dramatically?
Yeah. The background for this really goes back to the Japanese colonial legacy. There's the so-called comfort women issue involving sexual slavery of Korean and other women by Japan during World War II. Court cases in Korea that have demanded restitution from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Nippon Steel Corporation, and then Dokdo, as you mentioned. And Japan says all these issues were solved in 1965. South Korea disagrees. So what's different now, I think, is a number of things. First, frankly speaking, things are just much worse now than they were, for instance, in 2009, when a similar visit by the police chief happened in Japan. Obviously registered as displeasure, but not in such a dramatic and public way as we saw it in Washington last week. So I think that's something that's changed. Another thing that's changed is, of course, that in 2009, the government here in Korea was led by a conservative administration, which historically has better ties with Japan. Of course, now we have a progressive government led by Moon Jae-in, and frankly speaking, the relations between Seoul and Tokyo are already quite rocky. In addition to that, on the Japanese side, domestically, Kishida Fumio has just taken office with his new coalition. So this might be an initial measure to sort of send a message outwardly to Seoul, as well as to other parties, that Japan is going to remain staunch in its support of the fact that it thinks that Dokdo belongs to Japan. Also, domestically, this could be a way for Kishida to placate some of the hardliners in his own party, as well as his coalition partner, the Komito. And we also have to remember that there's a rising Japanese right populist party called the Japan Innovation Party out of Osaka. And this might be a way to some degree to protect his right flank a little bit from that party.
Right, well, Mason, now the US Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, she held the press conference alone, and while standing alone in that conference room must have been pretty awkward for her. While the US has been trying to encourage trilateral cooperation between Seoul, Washington and Tokyo since the beginning of the Biden administration, and while Seoul has shown willingness to improve bilateral ties with Japan on a number of occasions, Tokyo has been rather unresponsive. And, well, without the two neighbours getting along, what challenges or setbacks does the US face in this Indo-Pacific region?
Well, in some ways, China policy is easier when Seoul and Tokyo are on the same page. And that's in the large geopolitical sense, but also with respect to specific policies that the United States would like to see involving supply chain issues and cooperation there, or trade, or human rights. There are potential issues in aligning Seoul's new southern policy with the Quad, of which Japan is a member. The United States would like to see that more and more, and the more that Japan and South Korea aren't on the same page because of their bilateral issues, it makes regional cooperation more difficult. The United States would potentially like to see South Korea be more active in the Quad itself, perhaps as an ad hoc member, although perhaps not a permanent one. Just in general, the more that Japan and South Korea are cross purposes, the easier it is also for South Korea to look favorably at China, which currently the United States doesn't want. And then, of course, also North Korea policy, out of Washington focuses a lot on denuclearization, of course. And again, the more that South Korea and Japan are on the same page on what to do about Pyongyang, the better that is for Washington.
Right, so there are, of course, these common areas that they need to work on where cooperation is vital. But Mason, there are some rumours that Japan doesn't want South Korea to be part of Quad or Quad Plus or any of the regional initiatives there, including the CPTPP. Now, with these kind of sticking points and these hindrances between the two sides, how productive do you think the talks last week were? I mean, Wendy, Sherman insisted that they were productive and friendly, which does seem a bit unlikely, to be honest, given how things turned out. So what does that really mean in diplomatic speak?
Well, I think to some degree from the U.S. perspective, simply having everyone in the room and talking is already a plus. Clearly, this is something that the Biden administration favors much more so than the Trump administration, which was in some ways disdainful of South Korea, or at least of the Moon administration, for a number of different reasons. And at the very least was, let's say, neglectful or negligent with respect to trying to push forward on trilateral collaboration between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. And that's something that historically Washington has put great store in. I do think that we've seen a lot of meetings actually between Japan and South Korea and the United States since Biden has taken office. Clearly, this is something that the Biden campaign is very interested, or the Biden administration is very interested in. They campaigned on it in part as a part of their foreign policy. And we know that in this trilateral meeting of the deputy foreign ministers, in the Indo-Pacific was discussed largely in the terms of geopolitical interest and geostrategy. North Korea came up. The supply chain issue and resilience vis-a-vis China came up, of course. Human rights and values and democracy in the region were discussed. We know that South China Sea, freedom of navigation, overflight rights, all of those things came up as well. It wouldn't surprise me if perhaps relatively quietly Taiwan came up as an issue to be discussed as well. But of course, there's nothing groundbreaking that came out of that, nor should we have expected there to be that, or even a really serious concrete deliverable given the bilateral differences between Seoul and Tokyo.
Right, so no concrete deliverables that came out of that meeting, and that follows the U.S. China summit that happened earlier last week. Joe, to bring you into the conversation now, after that meeting the virtual meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi, President Joe Biden, he hinted at the possibility of a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics scheduled for February next year. And it was a little surprising given how Mr. Biden's summit with the Chinese leaders seemed to have slightly lowered the tensions between them. Do you think Washington will go through with the boycott, and how do you think China will react to this?
Well, I think both parties have stated their views on the boycott. The Biden administration has indicated that it is considering a diplomatic boycott. China, of course, would object to that, does object to it. I think that in light of the summit that has occurred, I think that Biden will go ahead with the boycott, the diplomatic boycott, partly because there has been some criticism that he has been too soft or too accommodating to Xi Jinping in the summit. And I think he will want to show to his domestic audience that he is, in fact, firm and strong on these issues with China. Both of them had the challenge of establishing their personal relationship with each other while at the same time maintaining a strong nationalistic position in terms of their domestic audiences. I think Xi Jinping probably got the better of that challenge, and Biden now, I think, will want to show that he has not yielded to Xi's great charms and will, in fact, go ahead with the boycott to show that the United States will stand up for the values that he talked about at their meeting on Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Tibet. And I think he will want to take some action to demonstrate. And it's not a drastic action. It's not as if we're boycotting the Olympics totally and not sending our athletes. They will go ahead with the games. But Biden himself, I think he said after the meeting, when he was asked the question, will there be a boycott, diplomatic boycott? And he said, I am the diplomatic representative for the United States, and whatever I decide to do, that will be the answer to the question. So I think my guess is he will not attend, and he will impose a diplomatic boycott for other U.S. personnel.
And what do you hope to see as a follow-up to this meeting, Joe?
Well, what I hope to see, I would love to see China start to realize that its policies in the region and globally are counterproductive, that we now have not only the United States moving closer to Taiwan, but other countries, including European countries, doing the same. And we have the Quad, and we have AUKUS, and various activities going on to indicate that the world is generally becoming quite concerned with the path that Xi Jinping is taking China on. And so my hope is that he would get that message, or that other people in his regime would get the message and whisper to him that they need to step back from this very aggressive posture. And there's some indication that that may have been happening even before the summit, because the rhetoric coming from Xi was somewhat softer in the last few weeks than it had been for several months before that. So I'm hoping that that's indicating some kind of trend. And of course, one of the things that he has to worry about is the Party Congress next year and the Olympics, and he has various reasons for trying to cool the tensions down a bit. And I think that was one of the purposes of having this summit, although it was Biden who requested it in the first place.
And now before we go, well, President Biden was also hoping to cooperate on areas like North Korea, of course. And well, when it comes to North Korea, now President Moon Jae-in of South Korea, he's been pushing for an end-of-war declaration in recent weeks, but not many share that enthusiasm, it seems. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said late last month that Seoul and Washington may differ on the precise sequence or timing or conditions for an end-of-war declaration to be made. And Wendy, Sherman seemed to be a bit vague about the whole declaration dialogue last week. What do you think what are the fundamental sticking points? And Joe, do you see this declaration materializing?
I think not. I think that there are too many concerns that the United States has about offering legitimacy to the Kim regime in North Korea, and with no concessions having been made by the North on its nuclear program, on its other kind of hostile activities in the region, that they will feel that we cannot make that kind of fundamental concession to the North. They've been asking for this, as you know, for decades, and the U.S. through all administrations has consistently resisted it until there was some substantive change in the way North Korea is behaving toward South Korea, toward Japan, toward the United States, and frankly, even in terms of the way it has been treating its own people. These gulags that have been existing in North Korea have not been discussed very much recently, but I have a feeling that we'll see a return to some of that discussion, considering the emphasis on human rights that the Biden administration has been placing.
Well, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. That was Mason Richey, Associate Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, and Joseph Bosco, former China Country Director for the Secretary of Defence and opinion contributor to The Hill. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.